Good morning. The 21st of February, 53 years ago, today, at the Audubon Ballroom, Brother Malcolm X was assassinated. Today I'm going to read the introduction in Chapter 2 of the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Rest easy, my brother. Introduction by M.S. Handler. The Sunday before he was to officially announce his rupture with Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X came to my home to discuss his plans and to give me some necessary documentation. Mrs. Handler had never met Malcolm before this fateful visit. She served us coffee and cakes while Malcolm spoke in the courteous, gentle manner that was his in private. It was obvious to me that Mrs. Handler was impressed by Malcolm. His personality filled our living room. Malcolm's attitude was that of a man who had reached a crossroads in his life and was making a choice under an inner compulsion. A wistful smile illuminated his countenance from time to time, a smile that said many things. I felt uneasy because Malcolm was evidently trying to say something which his pride and dignity prevented him from expressing. I sensed Malcolm was not confident that he would succeed in escaping from the shadowy world which had held him in its thrall. Mrs. Handler was quiet and thoughtful after Malcolm's departure. Looking up suddenly, she said, "You know, it was like having tea with a Black Panther." The description startled me. The Black Panther is an aristocrat in the animal kingdom. He is beautiful. He is dangerous. As a man, Malcolm X had the physical bearing and the inner self-confidence of a born aristocrat. He was potentially dangerous. No man in our time aroused fear and hatred in a white man as did Malcolm, because in him the white man sensed an implacable foe who could not be had for any price, a man unreservedly committed to the cause of liberating the black man in American society rather than integrating the black man into that society. My first meeting with Malcolm X took place in the March of 1963 in the Muslim restaurant of Temple No. 7 on Lenox Avenue. I had been assigned by the New York Times to investigate the growing pressures within the Negro community. 30 years of experience as a reporter in Western and Eastern Europe had taught me that forces in a developing social struggle are frequently buried beneath the visible surface and make themselves felt in many ways long before they burst out into the open. These generative forces make themselves felt through the power of an idea long before their organizational forms can openly challenge the establishment. It is the merit of the European political scientists and sociologists to give a high priority to the power of ideas in the social struggle. In the United States, it is our weakness to confuse the numerical strength of an organization and the publicity attached to leaders with the germinating forces that sow the seeds of social upheaval in our community. In studying the growing pressures within the Negro community, I had not only to seek the opinions of established leaders of the civil rights organizations, but opinions of those working in the penumbra of the movement, the underground, so to speak. This is why I sought out Malcolm X, whose ideas had reached me through the medium of Negro integrationists. Their thinking was already reflecting a high degree of nascent Negro nationalism. I did not know what to expect as I waited for Malcolm. I was the only white person in the restaurant, an immaculate establishment tended by sober, handsome, uncommunicative Negroes. Signs reading "Smoking Forbidden" were pasted on the highly polished mirrors. I was served coffee but became uneasy in this aseptic, silent atmosphere as time passed. Malcolm finally arrived. He was very tall, handsome, of impressive bearing. His skin had a bronze hue. I rose to greet him and extended my hand. Malcolm's hand came up slowly. I had the impression it was difficult for him to take my hand, but noblesse oblige, he did. Malcolm did a curious thing which he always repeated whenever we met in public in a restaurant in New York or Washington. He asked whether I would mind if he took a seat facing the door. I had similar requests put to me in Eastern European capitals. Malcolm was on the alert. He wished to see every person who entered the restaurant. I quickly realized that Malcolm constantly walked in danger. We spoke for more than 3 hours at this first encounter. His views about the white man were devastating, but at no time did he transgress against my own personality and make me feel that I, as an individual, shared in the guilt. He attributed the degradation of the Negro people to the white man. He denounced integration as a fraud. He contended that if the leaders of the established civil rights organizations persisted, the social struggle would end in bloodshed because he was certain the white man would never concede full integration. Malcolm argued the Muslim case for separation as the only solution in which the Negro could achieve his own identity, develop his own culture, and lay the foundation for a self-respecting, productive community. He was vague about where the Negro state could be established. Malcolm refused to see the impossibility of the white man conceding succession from the United States. At this stage of his career, he contended it was the only solution. He defended Islam as a religion that did not recognize color bars. He denounced Christianity as a religion designed for slaves and the Negro clergy as a curse of the black man, exploiting him for their own purposes instead of seeking to liberate him and acting as handmaidens of the white community in its determination to keep the Negroes in a subservient position. During this first encounter, Malcolm also sought to enlighten me about Negro mentality. He repeatedly cautioned me to beware of Negro affirmations of goodwill towards the white man. He said that the Negro had been trained to dissemble and conceal his real thoughts as a matter of survival. He argued that the Negro only tells the white man what he believes the white man wishes to hear, and that the art of disassembling reached a point where even Negroes cannot truthfully say they understand what their fellow Negroes believe. The art of deception practiced by the Negro was based on a thorough understanding of the white man's mores, he said. At the same time, the Negro has remained a closed book to the white man, who has never displayed any interest in understanding the Negro. Malcolm's exposition of his social ideas were clear and thoughtful, if somewhat shocking to the white initiative. But most disconcerting in our talk was Malcolm's belief in Elijah Muhammad's history of the origin of man and a genetic theory devised to prove the superiority of black over white, a theory stunning to me in its sheer absurdity. After this first encounter, I realized that there were two Malcolms, the private and the public person. His public performances on television and at meeting halls produced an almost terrifying effect. His implacable marshalling of facts and his logic had something of a new dialect, diabolic in its force. He frightened white television audiences, demolished his Negro opponents, but elicited a remarkable response from Negro audiences. Many Negro opponents in the end refused to make any public appearances on the same platform with him. The troubled white audiences were confused, disturbed, and felt themselves threatened. Some began to consider Malcolm evil incarnate. Malcolm appealed to the two most desperate elements of the black community, the depressed mass and the galaxy of Negro writers and artists who had burst on the American scene in the past decade. The Negro middle class, the Negro establishment abhorred and feared Malcolm as much as he despised it. The impoverished Negro respected Malcolm in the way wayward children respect the grandfather image. It was always a strange and moving experience to walk with Malcolm in Harlem. He was known to all. People glanced at him shyly. Sometimes Negro youngsters would ask for his autograph. It always seemed to me that their affection for Malcolm was inspired by the fact that although he had become a national figure, he was still a man of the people who they felt would never betray them. The Negroes also have suffered too long from betrayals, and in Malcolm they sensed a man of mission. They knew his origins, with which they could identify. They knew his criminal and prison record, which he never concealed. They looked upon Malcolm with a certain wonderment. Here was a man who had come from the lower depths, which they still inhabited, who had triumphed over his own criminality and his own ignorance to become a forceful leader and spokesman, an uncompromising champion of his people. Although many could not share his Muslim religious beliefs, they found in Malcolm's Puritanism a standing reproach to their own lives. See, Malcolm had purged himself with all the ills that afflict the depressed Negro mass: drugs, alcohol, tobacco, not to speak of criminal pursuits. His personal life was impeccable, of a Puritanism unattainable for the mass. Human redemption, Malcolm had achieved it in his own lifetime, and this was known to the Negro community. In his television appearances and at public meetings, Malcolm articulated the woes and aspirations of the depressed Negro mass in a way it was unable to do for itself. When he attacked the white man, Malcolm did it for the Negroes what they couldn't do for themselves. He attacked with a violence and anger that spoke for the ages of misery. It was not an academic exercise of just giving hell to Mr. Charlie. Many of the Negro writers and artists who are national figures today revered Malcolm for what they considered his ruthless honesty in stating the Negro case. Malcolm's refusal to compromise, Malcolm's search for a group identity that had been destroyed by the white man when he brought the Negro in chains from Africa. The Negro writers and artists regarded Malcolm as the great catalyst, the man who inspired self-respect and devotion in the downtrodden millions. A group of these artists gathered one Sunday in my home, and we talked about Malcolm. Their devotion to him as a man was moving. One said, "Malcolm will never betray us. We have suffered too much from betrayals in the past." Malcolm's attitude towards the white man underwent a marked change in 1964, a change that contributed to his break with Elijah Muhammad and his racist doctrines. Malcolm's meteoric eruption on the national scene brought him into wider contact with white men who were not the devils he thought they were. He was in much demand as a speaker at student forums in Eastern universities and had appeared at many by the end of his short career as a national figure. Malcolm always spoke respectfully and with a certain surprise of the positive response of white students to his lectures. A second factor that contributed to his conversion to wider horizons was a growing doubt about the authenticity of Elijah Muhammad's version of the Muslim religion, a doubt that grew into a certainty with more knowledge and more experience. Certain secular practices at the Chicago headquarters of Elijah Muhammad had come to Malcolm's notice, and he was profoundly shocked. Finally, Malcolm embarked on a number of prolonged trips to Mecca and the newly independent African states through the good offices of the representatives of the Arab League of the United States. It was on his first trip to Mecca that he came to the conclusion that he had yet to discover Islam. Assassin's bullets ended Malcolm's career on February 21st, 1965, before he was able to develop this new approach, which in essence recognized the Negro as an integral part of the American community, a far cry from Elijah Muhammad's doctrine of separation. Malcolm had reached the midpoint in redefining his relationship and his attitude to this country and the white-black relationship. He no longer inveighed against the United States, but against a segment of the United States represented by overt white race supremacists in the South and covert white supremacists in the North. It was Malcolm's intention to raise Negro militancy to a new high point, with the main thrust aimed at both Southern and Northern white supremacists. The Negro problem, which he had always said should be renamed the white man's problem, was beginning to assume new dimensions for him in the last months of his life. To the very end, Malcolm sought to refashion the broken strands between the American Negroes and the African culture. He saw in this the road to a new sense of group identity, a self-conscious role in history, and above all, a sense of a man's own worth when he claimed the white man had destroyed in the Negro. American autobiographical literature is filled with numerous accounts of remarkable men who poured themselves to the summit by their bootstraps, yet few as poignant as Malcolm's memoirs as testimony to the power of redemption and the force of human personality. The Autobiography of Malcolm X is a revelation. June of 1965. Chapter 2, Mascot. On June 27th of that year, 1937, Joe Louis knocked out James J. Braddock to become the heavyweight champion of the world. And all the Negroes in Lansing, like Negroes everywhere, went wildly happy with the greatest celebration of race pride our generation had ever known. Every Negro boy old enough to walk around wanted to be the next Brown Bomber. My brother Filbert, who had already become a pretty good boxer in school, was no exception. I was trying to play basketball. I was gangly and tall, but I wasn't very good at it. I was just too awkward. In the fall of that year, Filbert entered the amateur bouts that were held in Lansing's Prudent Auditorium. He did well, surviving the increasingly tough eliminations. I would go down to the gym and watch him train. It was very exciting. Perhaps without realizing it, I became secretly envious. For one thing, I know I could not help seeing some of my younger brother Reginald's lifelong admiration for me getting siphoned off to Filbert. People praised Filbert as a natural boxer. I figured that since we belonged to the same family, maybe I would become one too, so I put myself in the ring. I think I was 13 when I signed up for my first bout, but my height and raw-boned frame let me get away with claiming that I was about 16, the minimum age, and my weight of about 128 pounds got me classified as a bantamweight. They matched me with a white boy, a novice like myself, named Bill Peterson. I'll never forget him. When our turn in the next amateur bouts came up, all my brothers and sisters were there watching, along with just about everybody else I knew in town. They were there not so much because of me, but because of Filbert, who had begun to build up a pretty good following, and they wanted to see how his brother would do. I walked down the aisle between the people thronging the rows of seats and climbed in the ring. Bill Peterson and I were introduced, and then the referee called us together and mumbled all that stuff about fighting fair and breaking clean. Then the bell rang and we came out of our corners. I knew I was scared, but I didn't know, as Bill Peterson told me later on, that he was scared of me too. He was so scared I was going to hurt him that he knocked me down 50 times if he did once. He did such a job on my reputation in the Negro neighborhood that I practically went into hiding. A Negro just can't be whipped by somebody white and return with his head up to the neighborhood, especially in those days when sports and to a lesser extent show business were the only fields open to Negroes and when the ring was the only place a Negro could whip a white man and not be lynched. When I did show my face again, the Negroes rode me so badly I knew I had to do something. But the worst of all of my humiliations was my younger brother Reginald's attitude. He simply never mentioned the fight. It was the way he looked at me. He avoided looking at me. So when I went back to the gym, I trained hard, I beat the bags, I skipped rope, I grunted and sweated all over the place, and finally I signed up to fight Bill Peterson again. This time, the bouts were held in his hometown of Alma, Michigan. The only thing better about the rematch was that hardly anyone I knew was there to see it. I was particularly grateful for Reginald's entrance. The moment the bell rang, I saw a fist, then the canvas coming up, and 10 seconds later, the referee was saying 10 over me. It was probably the shortest fight in history. I lay there listening to the full count, but I couldn't move. To tell the truth, I wasn't sure I wanted to move. That white boy was the beginning and the end of my fight career. A lot of times in these later years, since I became a Muslim, I always thought back to that fight and reflected that it was Allah's work to stop me. I might have wound up punchy. Not long after that, I came into a classroom with my hat on. I did it deliberately. The teacher, who was white, ordered me to keep the hat on and to walk around the room until he told me to stop. That way, he said, everyone can see you. Meanwhile, we'll go on with the class for those who are here to learn something. I was still walking around when he got up from the desk and turned to the blackboard to write something on it. Everyone in the class was looking when at this moment I passed behind his desk, snatched up a thumbtack and deposited it in his chair. When he turned to sit back down, I was far from the scene of the crime, circling around the rear of the room. Then he hit the tack and I heard him holler and I caught a glimpse of him straddling up as I disappeared through the door. With my deportation record, I really wasn't shocked when the decision came that I had been expelled. I guess I must have had some vague idea that if I didn't have to go to school, I'd be allowed to stay on with the Geoniuses and wander around town and maybe get a job if I wanted one for pocket money. But I got rocked on my heels when the state man, whom I hadn't seen before, got me at the Johannes's and took me down to court. They told me I was going to a reform school. I was still 13 years old. But first I was going to a detention home. It was in Michigan, about 12 miles from Lansing. The detention home was where all the bad boys and girls from Ingham County were held on their way to reform school, waiting for their hearings. The white state man was Mr. Maynard Allen. He was nicer to me than most of the state welfare people had been. He even had consoling words for the Johanneses and Mrs. Adcock and the big boy. All of them were crying, but I wasn't. With the few clothes I owned stuffed into a box, we rode in his car to Mason. He talked as he drove along, saying that my school marks showed that if I would just straighten up, I could make something of myself. He said that reform school had the wrong reputation. He talked about what the word reform meant, to change and become better. He said the school was really a place where boys like me could have time to see their mistakes and start a new life and become somebody everybody would be proud of. And then he told me that the lady in charge of the detention home, Mrs. Swirling, and her husband were very good people. They were good people. Mrs. Swirling was bigger than her husband. I remember a big, buxom, robust, laughing woman, and Mr. Swirling was thin, with black hair and a black mustache and a red face, quiet and polite, even to me. They liked me right away, too. Mrs. Sherling showed me to my room, my own room, the first in my life. It was one in those huge dormitory-like buildings where kids in detentions were kept in those days and still are in most places. I discovered next with surprise that I was allowed to eat with the Sherlings. It was the first time I'd eaten with white people, at least with grown white people, since the Seventh-day Adventist country meetings. It wasn't my own exclusive privilege, of course, except for the very troublesome boys and girls at the detention home who were kept locked up, those who had run away and had been caught and brought back or something like that. All of us ate with the Sherlings, sitting at the head of the long tables. They had a white cook helper, I recall, Lucille Lathrop. It amazes me how these names come back from a time I hadn't thought about them for more than 20 years. Lucille treated me well, too. Her husband's name was Dwayne Lathrop. He worked somewhere else, but he stayed there at the detention home on the weekends with Lucille. I noticed again how white people smell different from us and how their food tastes different, not seasoned like Negro cooking. I began to sweep and mop and dust around the Sherling's house as I'd done with Big Boy at the Johannes's. They all liked my attitude, and it was out of their liking for me that I soon became accepted by them as a mascot. I know now. They would talk about anything and everything with me standing right there hearing them, the same way people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. They would even talk about me or about niggers as though I wasn't there, as if I wouldn't understand what the word meant. 100 times a day they used that word nigger. I suppose that in their own minds they meant no harm. In fact, they probably meant well. It was the same with the cook Lucille and her husband Dwayne. I remembered one day when Mr. Sherling, as nice as he was, came in from Langston where he had been through the Negro section and said to Mrs. Sherling right in front of me, "I just can't see how those niggers can be so happy and be so poor." He talked about how they lived in shacks but had those big, shiny cars out front. And Mrs. Sherling said, me standing right there, niggers are just that way. That scene always stayed with me. It was the same with the other white people, most of them local politicians. When they would come visit the Sherlings, one of their favorite parlor topics was niggers. One of them was a judge who was in charge of me in Lansing. He was a close friend of the Sherlings. He would ask about me when they came, and they would call me in, and he would look at me and look at me up and down, this expression approving, like he was examining a fine coat or a pedigreed pup. I knew they must have told him how I acted and how I worked. What I'm trying to say is that it never dawned upon them that I could understand that I wasn't a pet but a human being. They didn't give me credit for having the same sensibility, intellect, and understanding that they would have been ready and willing to recognize in a white boy in my position. But it has historically been the case with white people in their regard for black people that even though we might be with them, we aren't considered of them. Even though they appear to have opened the door, it was still closed. Thus, they never did really see me, and this is the sort of kindly condensation which I try to clarify today to these integration-hungry Negroes about their liberal white friends, these so-called good white people, most of them anyway. I don't care how nice one is to you, the only thing you must always remember is that almost never does he really see you as he sees himself, as he sees his own kind. He may stand with you through thin, but not thick. And when the chips are down, you find that as fixed in him as his bone structure is, his sometimes subconscious conviction is that he's always better than anybody black. And that's the end of chapter 2. Of the Black Man's Read Aloud Hour. Have a great day on the 53rd anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X.